Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. So the last week or so we've been talking about cellular respiration, which is a catabolic process where we're breaking things down to release energy. Photosynthesis is going to be the anabolic counterpart to cellular respiration. And so by anabolic, we mean we're building things up. And so in the process of photosynthesis, plants, which we see in our picture here, they're going to absorb energy from the sun and use that absorbed energy to convert carbon dioxide, which is floating around in the atmosphere, into more complex carbon-containing compounds, things like glucose or starch or cellulose. A lot of times we always just seem to associate photosynthesis only with glucose, but all of these things are produced during that process of photosynthesis. And the reaction of photosynthesis is actually broken down into two independent reactions. And so the light reactions, this is when we convert light energy, so sunlight, into chemical energy in the form of ATP and something called NADPH. You may recognize this. It looks very similar to what we saw in cellular respiration, which was NADH. This is a very similar molecule, but there's just an extra phosphate group added to it. So instead of nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, this is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Very similar compound, does the same exact job. It carries electrons from one reaction to the other. And then the light-independent reactions, we're going to use our ATP and NADPH in order to make complex carbohydrates. So we're going to talk about each of these steps in a little bit more detail, but first we want to get some of the details out of the way. So this is a general model of a chloroplast, and I'm just going to show you where everything happens, and then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what happens in each of those steps. So in the chloroplast, there are these little green discs called thylakoids, which is what you're looking at right here. One thing I didn't include is that a stack of these thylakoids is called a granum. And the thylakoid is where our light-dependent reaction is going to happen. And so again, in the light-dependent reaction, we get energy from the sun. So our sunlight energy is going to travel into the thylakoid, where it's going to meet up with chlorophyll. And we'll talk a little bit more about chlorophyll here in a moment. When that happens, water then gets split into oxygen and the hydrogen ions are released. When that happens, ADP and inorganic phosphate are combined together to make ATP, and then NADP plus and the hydrogen that was released from that water, along with the electrons released from the water, is used to create NADPH. From there, we move into the stroma, which the stroma is the area inside the membrane of the chloroplast, but outside of the thylakoid. And so the stroma is where the light-independent reaction, also known as the Calvin cycle, is going to take place. So Calvin cycle, light-independent reaction, same thing. In that reaction, we have carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it's going to take the energy from ATP, and it's going to take the energy from NADPH, and it's going to assemble those together into sugars. Again, glucose is the most common thing that we talk about when we're talking about photosynthesis, but there's some other compounds that can be made from that as well. All right, a couple other things to get out of the way before we talk about the process. When we're talking about sunlight, we're talking about electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation is a form of energy that travels in the form of waves. So just like sound waves, radio waves, electromagnetic radiation also travels through space in waves. The thing about electromagnetic radiation is that the wavelength is inversely proportional to the energy. So what that means is a short wavelength equals high energy, whereas a long wavelength equals low energy. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment. Another thing about light, not only does light travel as a wave, but it also produces what we call photons. And light has this weird ability to act both as energy, and it actually acts as, it has the properties of matter. And when we talk about that, we're talking about photons. So photons act similar to matter, but they still have no mass. And there's three things that can happen to a molecule when a photon encounters it. The first thing that can happen is that light can just bounce off. Or a better way of saying that is that it is reflected. Another thing that a photon can do is it can be transmitted by a molecule, which means that it simply just passes straight through that molecule. And the last thing that can happen is it can be absorbed by that molecule. And when molecules absorb photons, it increases their energy. So by absorbing photons, you're going to increase energy. Great example of that, take a black cast iron skillet, put it out in the sun, let it absorb some photons, come back later, put your hand on it, it's going to be hot because it absorbed energy from those photons. Anything that absorbs photons or absorbs sunlight energy is called a pigment. And these are things that absorb energy in the visible spectrum of light. So to give you an example here, let's look at this picture. This is the full electromagnetic spectrum. So on the left-hand side here we have longer wavelengths, and on the right-hand side we have shorter wavelengths. So long wavelengths are like 10 to the third meters. So we're talking about a kilometer right here. So things like radio waves can have a very, very long wavelength. That's why we use radio waves for communication, listening to music, things like that, because they can travel long distances, and because of their long wavelength, they're not really very harmful to us. At the other end of the spectrum here, we have wavelengths 10 to the negative 12 meters. So very, 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 very short wavelength. What that means is they have a lot of high energy. And this is things like gamma radiation, X-rays, the emissions from radioactive elements. These are things that are very damaging to us, and they can cause all sorts of problems with our cells if we don't protect ourselves from them. One thing I want you to notice here in this spectrum is that this very narrow little band right here is all the light that we can see. So from red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, all of that exists right in this little bit right here. Everything outside of that are forms of electromagnetic radiation that we are not capable of seeing. So basically what happens here is if this green dot down here at the bottom, this represents our pigment. I'm just going to put a P in there to represent pigment. And up here, I guess I'll label Mr. Sun as well. So what happens is we've got our sunlight, we've got our pigment, and then if we represent moving up as an increase in energy, when the sunlight hits that pigment, it's going to energize it, and it's going to increase that pigment molecule's energy, and it's going to allow it to carry out some chemical reactions, or allow it to harness that energy for other purposes. Specifically, when we're talking about photosynthesis, that pigment we're referring to is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is an interesting pigment. It absorbs blue light really well, and it absorbs red light really well. What it does not absorb very well is green light. That's why plants look green, because that green light from the visible spectrum is actually reflected back at us. And you can actually measure that by determining something called an absorption spectrum. So this is a graph that shows the wavelength of light on the x-axis and then the amount of light absorbed on the y-axis. And so you'll notice here chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, they absorb really well over here in this blue-green range, and then again they absorb really well up here in this orange-red range, but right here in the middle where we're kind of greenish, yellowish, there's very little absorption at all. And plants can get around that by using other pigments like carotenoids. These are the things that make carrots orange, to get a little bit more energy from the sunlight. Along with the absorption spectrum, we can also look at an action spectrum. And if you look at this graph, this superimposes, in the background here we've got our absorption spectrum we were looking at before, and this action spectrum shows you the photosynthetic rate versus the wavelength of light. And you can see over here in the green or the blue purple end, we're very active, and over here in the red end, we've got a decent amount of activity as well. But down here where the green light is, there's not much activity, and that green light is actually being reflected back out. And that, again, that's why we see plants as being green. All of these pigments that are found in plant cells are organized into something called a photosystem. And a photosystem is just a protein that's embedded with somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 individual chlorophyll molecules. And these photosystems are embedded then in that membrane of the thylakoid in the chloroplast. All right, so that sets the stage. That tells us a little bit about all the different components of photosynthesis. And now let's talk about the two reactions themselves. So in the light-dependent reactions, remember we're inside of the thylakoid membrane here. In these, here we have photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. And I know this seems kind of counterintuitive that photosystem 2 comes before 1. The short story is photosystem 1 was discovered first, photosystem 2 was discovered second, and that's how they were named. So don't think about it too much. That's just the way things work. And you'll also notice there's some numbers in here, P680 and P700. This refers to the wavelength of light that these photosystems absorb the best. So photosystem 2 absorbs light at a wavelength of 680 nanometers, and photosystem 1 absorbs light best at a wavelength of 700 nanometers. Again, we've got an arrow here indicating an increase in energy. And some other things to notice here, we've got our old friend water down here at the bottom. So the light-dependent reactions, you can imagine these two photosystems, they're actually embedded in this thylakoid membrane. So remember, we've got our, I'm not going to draw the whole thing out, but we've got our phospholipid bilayer here that these are embedded in. And so this is going to be our thylakoid membrane right here. And so in photosystem 1, notice there's an electron right here being held onto by this photosystem. When the sunlight hits that photosystem, it's going to energize that electron. And so it's going to raise its energy level. It's not actually going to float up out of the photosystem. This is just to show you that it's increasing in energy. When photosystem 2 loses that electron, it becomes very unstable and it wants to fill that spot with another electron. The best source of electrons for the photosystems to do that comes from the oxygen, or from the water rather. So our water gets split apart, our electrons get taken back into photosystem 2, our oxygen at this point is released to go off into the atmosphere, and we're very thankful for that because we need it to breathe. And then the two hydrogen ions that are left behind can be used for the later steps of the light-dependent reaction. So now this electron has been energized and it's ready to do some work. Just like in cellular respiration, the thylakoid has an electron transport chain. And when that electron moves through that chain, it converts ADP into ATP. From there, it gets grabbed onto by photosystem 1, which again absorbs more sunlight. It energizes that electron again, but now this is where the electrons are added to our electron carrier, NADPH, and that forms NADP plus to form NADPH. So again, I'm going to back up here and get rid of all this, and we'll show you one more time. Photosystem 2 with our electrons absorbs sunlight. Those electrons get energized. Water is split to provide us a new source of electrons and hydrogen ions. Those electrons travel through the electron transport chain to produce ATP. They're accepted by photosystem 1, which again absorbs more sunlight energy, and those energized electrons are then used to make NADPH. This picture gives you a little bit better indication of what's going on here. So here's our photosystem 2 again. It absorbs photons, and these electrons travel through our electron transport chain and then end up in photosystem 1. And then those electrons are going to keep traveling through until they're incorporated into NADPH. So just like our electron transport chain in cellular respiration, those electrons are going to help pump hydrogen ions into the inside of the thylakoid membrane, and then those hydrogens are going to flow back out through ATP synthase to make ATP. So just like the first couple stages of cellular respiration are trying to charge our batteries or get the energy needed for oxidative phosphorylation, same sort of thing happens here. We get electrons from water. They travel through the electron transport chain, creating a hydrogen ion gradient, which again leads to ATP production. Those electrons get re-energized, and then they get incorporated into NADPH. Sometimes, though, the cells need extra ATP, and so in order to do that, they can follow a very similar process where photosystem 2 absorbs our energy, we energize our electrons, goes through the electron transport chain to make ATP, but instead of those electrons then going off to form NADPH, they can cycle back through, making more ATP, and keep on cycling through, making more and more ATP in a process that we call cyclic photophosphorylation. All right, so now we've got our energy sources. From the light-dependent reactions, we've produced ATP and we've produced NADPH. Now these energy sources are going to move out of the thylakoid into the stroma of the mitochondria, the chloroplast. This is a really complex set of chemical reactions, and we're going to really simplify things down a little bit. So all the parts that are involved here, I'm going to put carbon dioxide up here at the top, and then what we're going to start with is something called RUBP, and this stands for ribulose biphosphate. The first step of the Calvin cycle is something that we call the fixation phase. And in chemical terms, when we say that something is being fixed, we mean it's being added to something else. So in the fixation phase, carbon dioxide is being added to RUBP, and what we get out of that is an intermediate molecule called 3-PG. And that stands for 3-phosphoglycerate. Now, any of these intermediate molecules, you do not need to know the names of those. I'm just telling you right now to give you a little bit more of the story. And so this 3-phosphoglycerate goes through a few steps where it gets energy from ATP and it gets some energy from NADPH. So that ATP becomes ADP and our NADPH becomes NADP plus. And ultimately what it turns into is something called G3P, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And now this is what's actually taken out of the Calvin cycle. This is what we call the reduction phase, because this 3-PG is being reduced. It's getting electrons added to it in order to make G3P. This can then split off. It can become glucose. G3P can become starch. It can become cellulose. It's very, very useful with plants. It can become any component of that plant. After that G3P is produced, there's some leftover G3P molecules that continue in this cycle into what we call the regeneration phase. And this is where our G3P gets recycled back into it first becomes ribulose monophosphate. A little bit more ATP is used up, and ultimately we recycle our starting molecule, which is RUBP. One last little bit that I want to add to this is that there is an enzyme involved here. I know I told you don't need to remember the names of them, but this is one that's really good to just recognize. Rubisco is the enzyme that allows carbon dioxide to be fixed to RUBP. It's probably the most ubiquitous or widely found enzyme on the planet, which is why it's good to know. If you see that word Rubisco pop up anywhere, it should just trigger in your brain that we're talking about photosynthesis. So I know that was a lot. I know it's kind of confusing, but that's all of photosynthesis, and I hope that you found this helpful.